In 1914, when Germany went to war, average German ration consisted of 750 grams of bread, 375 grams of meat, and 1 kilo 500 grams of potatoes. Yet in 1916, the rations were cut drastically to just 250 grams of meat. There is no official data on bread, but we know from personal diaries of soldiers that the bread rations were cut too. For comparison, British rations were, for the entire war, 1 pound 1/4 of fresh or frozen meat, 1 pound of preserved or salt meat, 1 1/4 pound of bread, or 1 pound of biscuits or flour, 4 ounces of bacon, 3 ounces of cheese, 5/8 ounces of tea, 4 ounces of jam, 3 ounces of sugar, half ounce of salt, 1/36 ounce of pepper, 1/20 ounce of mustard, 8 ounces of fresh or 2 ounces of dried vegetables, 1/10 of gill lime juice if fresh vegetables not issue, half gill of rum, not exceeding 2 ounces tobacco per week. But why were rations cut? Every good general knows that the army marches on its stomach. Yet at the end of the war in 1918, many German soldiers started eating rats or even lice they plucked from their bodies. Well, it happens that at the same time the German soldiers were close to starvation, fighting their trenches. In Germany alone, up to 763,000 civilians already died of starvation. Most of them were children. And the reason behind all of those can be summoned in just one word: blockade. Or to be more accurate, British naval blockade. The British, with their overwhelming sea power, established a naval blockade of Germany immediately on the outbreak of war in August 1914, basing a comprehensive list of contraband that all but prohibited American trade with Central Powers. And in early November 1914, by declaring the North Sea to be a war zone, with any ships entering the North Sea doing so at their own risk. The blockade was unusually restrictive in that even foodstuffs were considered contraband of war. There were complaints about breaches of international law, but most neutral merchant vessels agreed to dock at British ports to be inspected and then escorted, lest any illegal cargo destined for Germany throughout British minefields to their destinations. The Royal Navy soon after closed off access to the North Sea and English Channel. The German Hochseeflotte of course didn't remain idle. Germans made severe attempts to break the British blockade. Those attempts finally led to the famous Battle of Jutland in 1916. Although it had been a tactical victory for the Germans, despite what so-called British historians or even the English Wikipedia might tell by claiming that the battle was indecisive, or even the draw, which is complete BS considering losses both in ships and tons sunk by both sides. It failed to achieve its main strategic goal of ending the British naval blockade. A memorandum to the British War Cabinet on 1st January 1917 stated that there were very few supplies reaching Germany or its allies via the North Sea or other areas such as Austro-Hungary's Adriatic ports, which had been subjugated to a French blockade since 1914. By 1915, Germany's imports had fallen by 55% from its pre-war levels, and the exports were 53% of what they had been in 1914. Apart from leading to shortage in vital raw materials such as coal and non-ferrous metals, the blockade also deprived Germany of supplies of fertilizers that were vital to agriculture. The situation is similar to that happening right now in the third world countries during the war in Ukraine. That led to severe shortage of basic goods in Germany. The situation was in fact so bad that already in 1916 basic goods such as grain, potatoes, bread and milk became so scarce that many people were obligated by the state to consume instead the so-called ersatz products instead, such as powdered milk and Kriegsbrot, which was a substitute of bread made usually of rye, although in practice almost any grain available at the moment was used. This bread was known for the fact that it contained so-called fillers instead of significant part of flour normally needed to make bread. When you don't have enough flour for the bread and you are forced to use anything that will on paper fill the stomach, you know that situation is bad, but don't worry. In 1917, everything was under control, except that it wasn't. During the winter of 1916 to 1917, there was a failure of the potato crop, which resulted in the urban population having to subsist largely on the Swedish turnips. That period became known as the Sträckkrubben winter or turnip winter. However, by the time the first mass civilian deaths caused by starvation led to statewide food panic, which then resulted in massive food riots, not only in big German cities, but also in Vienna and Budapest. The German government made strong attempts to counter the effects of the blockade. The Hindenburg program of German economic mobilization was launched on 31 August 1916 and designed to raise productivity by compulsory employment of all men between the ages of 17 and 60. A complicated rationing system initially introduced in January 1915 aimed to ensure that the minimum nutritional need was met, with war kitchens providing cheap mass meals to impoverished civilians in larger cities. All of those schemes enjoy only limited success, and the average daily diet of 1000 calories was insufficient to maintain a good standard of health, which resulted by 1917 in widespread disorders caused by malnutrition, such as scurvy, tuberculosis, and dysentery. Failing agricultural output in 1917 forced to put women into the farm's job instead of managing factories. We can clearly see that in statistics of produced explosives. Until 1917, Germany was winning on the production front. However, in 1917, we can clearly see that Germany had faced big problems in increasing its own military production drastically, while the British Empire continued to steadily increase its own wartime production. Germany couldn't compete anymore with the Entente because while the female population in Britain and France was committed to war production, the women in Germany were working in the field. In 1918, with the US joining the war on the side of Entente despite the victory on the Eastern Front and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the situation for Central Powers became critical. The industrial might of the USA, not exhausted by the war, had made it impossible to win the war of attrition. Germany needed to strike, with their forces previously deployed on the Eastern Front, and achieve quick and decisive victory on the Western Front. So on 21st March of 1918, Germans launched their spring offensive. As we all know, the offensive had failed. There are several reasons for this, however, one is certainly overlooked. When reading about the offensive, we will often hear that the Germans had trouble supplying their troops after the initial success. What is least known, however, is the fact that there was not enough food for some units. Germans' military units had been exhausted and hungry when advancing, a factor that can have a great importance. If the Germans didn't have enough food for their soldiers during their most important offensive, then imagine how bad the situation was for the civilians. It is hard to find exact information about the severity of food shortage during the spring offensive of 1910. However, we have some data that might be helpful in understanding the severity of shortage. In July 1910, milk rations amounted to 12% of pre-war consumption. There are no exact statistics for the number of calories daily for the year 1910, but there are for the previous year, and they are bad. The daily rations for the non-productive citizens of German Empire amounted to 1000 calories, about 40% of daily pre-work intake. There are some reports claiming that the season fluctuation in 1910 increased the amounts of daily calories to 1400. However, this is a really optimistic assumption, and most of these extra calories were probably never distributed among the citizens of the German Empire. There is no accurate civilian data for Austria-Hungary, but the situation was probably as bad as in Germany because of local crop failures in 1918. Germany was hungry and exhausted. So when Austro-Hungary disintegrated in October of 1918, German High Command knew that the war was de facto lost. On the 29th September 1918, General Erich Ludendorff told the Kaiser that the military front would soon collapse. However, before the German army was decisively defeated in the field by the Entente, the government was overthrown in November Revolution. The Kaiser had to abdicate and was forced into exile in the Netherlands. The main reason for the revolution was, despite what many Marxists may try to tell you, was hunger. The Central Powers never lost the war military. Not a single inch of the German territory was under Entente control when the armistice was signed on 11 November 1918. The Central Powers were starved into submission. The exact number of deaths caused by the British naval blockade in Germany varies greatly. However, the German Board of Public Health in December 1918 claimed that 763,000 German civilians died from starvation and disease caused by the blockade throughout December 1918. And that number don't include the deaths caused by the epidemic of Spanish flu, that certainly was far more deadly for the starved and deprived population of Germany, as well as long-term deaths caused by the disease later. The worst is, however, that the British naval blockade didn't end upon signing the armistice. It lasted until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. This way, the Entente countries were trying to maintain pressure on the newly formed Weimar Republic to sign the unconditional surrender, despite the fact that the German government had agreed to sign the peace treaty based solely on the 14 points of President Woodrow Wilson. This unnecessary and cruel prolonging of the blockade costed another few 100,000 civilian lives in Germany. So we might conclude quite confidently that the real death toll of British naval blockade was probably between 1 million to 2 million of civilian lives. This was, to put it bluntly, the genocide, similar to that committed by Nazis 20 years later in the occupied territories. Yet the Nazis had answered for their crimes and were punished for them, but there was never any justice for the millions of Germans starved by the British and French governments with premeditation. Nobody in the British nor French governments and their armed forces answered for his crimes against the humanity. Nobody took responsibility for this genocide, and even now, more than 100 years after the British naval blockade ceased to starve the Germans, nobody remembers and nobody cares. The victors really did write the history. And with this pessimistic conclusion, we had arrived at the end of this video. Thank you for your attention. Please consider subscribing, liking and sharing this video. Farewell, comrades. See you next time.